Hi, everyone. This is Dr. Gail Carson. Welcome to Living Regret Free, a program that shows you how to live a better and more joyful life. As an added bonus, I invite you to listen to an introduction to my Mindset Matters program, which ties into this so well. Go to www.sobmindset.com. It's free, and I know you will enjoy it. If you'd like to contact me personally, drop me a line at gailcarson13@gmail.com or go to my website, www.spunkyoldbroad.com, and sign up for my weekly newsletter. My guest today is Alan Weiss, PhD. And Alan is a consultant, speaker, best-selling author, and described by the New York Post as one of the most highly regarded independent consultants in America. His consulting firm, Summit Consulting Group, has attracted clients such as Merck, Hewlett-Packard, GE, Mercedes-Benz, and more than 500 leading organizations. He's the author of 64 books, many of which have been included in university curricula and translated into 15 languages. But his newest release is Fearless Leadership: Overcoming Reticence, Procrastination, and the Voices of Doubt Inside Your Head. And of course, I have to say that I've known Alan for, I think, over 40 years at this point. So welcome, Alan. How are you?
Thank you, Gail. I could listen to you forever. That was wonderful.
Thank you. Well, you've got so many books on consulting and so many books on, now you're getting into a lot of, life purpose books. So what motivated you to write Fearless Leadership?
Well, for years and years, I wrote on fees and value, and I sort of pioneered value-based fees for consultants. And I got to the point where I realized that people weren't charging enough because their self-esteem was low. So I started working on self-esteem, and I did workshops, and I wrote about that. But over the past year or so, I realized that people's self-esteem is low because they're afraid. People are afraid of both overt and covert fears. And so I decided I'd write about that. And it applies to both corporate executives and managers as well as entrepreneurs.
Well, do you think that these people, whether they're entrepreneurs or, corporate CEOs, C-suite people, that they take fear seriously?
I think they take fear too seriously. I think they spend too much of their time afraid, and they're afraid of things they shouldn't be afraid of.
Well, you say it's a hardwired human trait, but that fear is learned. So I guess that happens when we're very young. I mean, we learn that there are things that, if we touch a hot stove, we're going to find out it's hot, and that's not going to happen again. And that people aren't always going to be fair with us, and so forth and so on. But why do you think stress is and fear is learned so deeply?
Well, most people feel it is hardwired, that it's some remnant from, running from saber-toothed tigers. And I don't believe that. I believe that, and by the way, I think fear is also learned as an adult. I think people tell you, don't go into this buyer's office. It's frightening. He's very tough. Don't try to talk to this person about a social relationship because they're very choosy and you might be rejected. So I think that we tend to cower from fear because we don't keep it in proportion. In other words, my father was a paratrooper in World War II. He jumped into enemy guns. That's something to be afraid of. I've never, ever gone into a buyer's office and had someone shoot at me. I think we have to keep our perspective. You can't even come out of a buyer's office poorer than when you went in. But we tend to fear itself. And in a volatile world, with all this ambiguity, it's worse and worse.
So what do you think real fear is then versus what's perceived fear?
Well, look, real fear, if somebody comes at me with a gun, I'm afraid. If I see a tornado coming down the street, I'm afraid. There are occasions for real fear when your well-being or your family and so forth are threatened. But there's no fear in being rejected. There's no fear in trying to innovate. There's no fear in failing. But we attach fear to it because our egos are so delicate.
Well, that's interesting. That's interesting because I'm trying to think of many situations where, now, this is an interesting question. I've been really interested to hear your viewpoint on this. Do you think men and women look at fear differently?
Well, it's been nice talking to you, Gail. Have a good day. Yeah, I do. I think that there are distinctions, and of course, they're not pure distinctions. In other words, not all men and not all women. So let's get that straight. But I think women, in my experience, have been more fearful about not being liked. Consequently, they don't stick up for themselves as well. There was some surveys done years ago that showed that women, of course, were paid less in organizations than were men doing similar jobs, and they were promoted less often than men doing similar jobs. But when they looked into it, they found something interesting. And I'm not arguing against that there's no gender discrimination, but I will tell you this: the women did not ask for the promotions as much as the men asked for them, and the women did not negotiate their raises as much as the men negotiated them. So I think women do fear more souring a relationship. And, the stereotype is that supposedly men can argue, and after they're done, they say, let's go out and have a beer. Whereas women are afraid that if they argue, the next day people won't like them. Now, maybe that's an over-exaggeration, but that's what I've seen.
Well, no, that's true, because I was leading a group. We were doing a kind of a mastermind, and I said, if there's a job posted and it says these are the requisite skills, and you've got one of the four, a woman would never even apply. Where a guy would apply and say, well, look, I'll try. All he can say is no. And just the observation of how women approach something where they don't feel that they are all qualified for something is different than a man goes at it. So it's really true. But you also talk about the 3 F's of paralyzed leadership in your book. So what are they and how do they play out?
Well, which ones are you referring to exactly?
Well, I don't know. You've got 3 F's of paralyzed leadership, so I don't know which ones they are.
All right, well, several different entries, so I was just wondering. So, okay, so listen, first you've got a fear of not being liked, of being unpopular, of being seen as an ogre, and the key here is you're not there to be liked, you're there to be respected. And so people are too oriented toward people liking them, men and women, rather than being respected and consequently making the tough decisions. And that leads me to the second one, which is the fear of failure. And people don't seem to recognize the fact that if you're not failing, you're not trying. And consequently, when people say I've never failed, either they have failed and don't know it, or they've never tried anything difficult, or they're just lying, And so people nevertheless have this fear of failure. And finally, people have a certain fear of success. And that is, they strive for something, and then they say, oh my God, what if I get this? Will I really be able to perform the way people are expecting me to? What will happen? And, I've coached entrepreneurs, for example, who are afraid of failure. They're afraid of not getting business. But then they tell me, well, what if these 3 proposals are accepted at once? I don't think I could ever do them all. So they're afraid of success. So if you're afraid of failing and afraid of success, you got a tough life.
Absolutely. I can certainly understand people being afraid of failure. I mean, you do have to fail in order to progress. I don't know how you would get to where you want to go if you don't fail. But having a fear of success, that just is so an antithesis to me, because that's just not how I think. But I also believe the first one you talked about people thinking you're not nice, but you need to be respected. I also think that's more of a female trait than a male trait, even though women are slowly shedding that part of their skin. It's still, I think, a very big part of how they perceive things. Well, but I'm sorry, what were you going to say?
I just want to point out, it's also very big with men. I mean, men too, they want to be liked. They don't want to be seen as oppressive. They don't want to be seen as being insensitive to people's needs. I mean, especially today with real concern in the workplace and sensitivity in the workplace about gender and ethnicity and hidden bias and social responsibility. I think it is a problem. And I'm not saying that you should be callous toward people, but I am saying that people best follow someone they respect, not necessarily someone they like. They don't need another buddy. What they need is a leader.
Well, that brings us to the point of really what makes a great leader. I mean, what do you think makes a great leader?
I think there are a few very important traits. I think one is that you have to make tough decisions. You need to be able to fire people. Usually, when you fire someone, you're doing them a favor because they're miserable, they're not performing, but you have to make tough decisions as a leader that nobody else makes. The buck stops there. I think the second thing is you have to be flexible. And, Machiavelli said that he reflected that the causes of success or failure of people Was their manner of suiting their conduct to the times? And there's no one sustainable leadership behavior. You know, life changes, the world changes, business changes, social mores change. And so you have to be able to be light on your feet and agile and change accordingly. It's a different leadership world today than it was even 5 years ago. I think the third thing is you need a sense of humor. You need to be able to put people at ease, put things in perspective. You need to be able to use self-effacing humor, and you need to be able to alleviate stress by using humor. And then the final thing is you need command of the language. You need to be able to communicate extraordinarily well today because it's too easy to be misunderstood and misinterpreted.
Well, that's so true. And I'm just curious, in your recent dealings with leaders, especially the male leaders, what kinds of things are they saying about, we say the new things that are going on in the workplace? I mean, how do they feel about the Me Too movement? Most men today don't know what they're supposed to do. They don't know how they're supposed to act. They don't know if they touch somebody. In fact, I got such a kick out of when they were showing Joe Biden on TV and that he touched his wife, I guess, on her shoulder. And somebody said, oh, that was so sexist and you shouldn't do that. And I thought to myself, he loves his wife. Why shouldn't he touch her, you know? But what are some of the things that people are saying that you come in contact with about the new rules of social mores?
Well, they are confused. I mean, it is confusing. And people are very different. I mean, there's no blanket response here. And I think that if we are unduly conservative, we lose, no pun intended, the human touch. That is, you know, high tech, high touch. We need to be able to be responsive and sensitive to people. And it's hard to be that because political correctness, political language really is a restriction on free speech. And where do you go to get some counsel here? Well, you can go find a great coach, you know, like me, or sometimes you go to human resources, and human resources doesn't help you very much because they too are careful and conservative.
That's true.
I think that you raised a good point, and that is people are really, I think men and women are equally confused about how to act.
Wow, that is so true. That is so true. So you know, that brings up the whole deal of fear again. Do you feel there is a relationship between fear and procrastination? And then does that lead to failure?
Well, it does. Procrastination is a manifestation of fear. I'll give you an example. People procrastinate. That is, they don't get around to doing things because the fear of doing something incorrectly and being critiqued for it is greater than the fear of being critiqued for not moving fast enough. And so they take the lesser of two evils. Procrastination, not getting things done, is based on the fear of doing it and not doing it well enough to suit others. And that's exactly right.
Wow, but how do you get out of that, Alan? How do you learn to deal with that?
Well, you have to understand that fear about what people think of you is simply a negative image that you have, which you need to dismiss. You need to understand that unsolicited feedback, that is feedback you do not ask for, is worthless. It's for the sender, not the receiver. So if you ask for feedback from someone you respect, or someone you respect happens to offer, that's one thing. But random feedback is useless. Worrying about whether you get tens on smile sheets when you speak or you get an ovation is useless. And the trouble is we're using other people's metrics. We're not using our own metrics. So self-mastery is about knowing when you're good and when you're not so good. And that alleviates the fear of being judged by others. Am I answering your question, Gail?
Yeah, you are. And I'm thinking back, you know, now smile sheets are not so important as they were 20 years ago. But I remember when I first started speaking, and and this actually was at an NSA meeting. This drove me nuts. They used to bring you up on stage, and you would give, you know, a 5-minute whatever, and people would then fill out and critique you. And I actually had someone say, her lipstick does not match her jacket. And I thought, is that what you got out of what I said? And then in one seminar I did, the critique was, you know, they shouldn't have had donut holes. They should have had the whole donut. And I thought, you know, where are these people coming from? So there's a lot of people who you run into and that you come in contact with that have things to say about you and what you're doing that have nothing to do with your ability or your presentation or your solutions or anything else. And sometimes it does take a lot to not get frustrated by that.
Well,
So,
worse than that, it's often intended to knock you down in order to elevate them. And that's why I tell people have no regard for unsolicited feedback. It's simply not worth anything.
that's true. And you also say there's a PowerPoint in asking why. So, how does that put what we fear into perspective?
If you ask yourself, why am I afraid? You'll have to come out with some empirical evidence or some observed behavior that will tell you why you're afraid. So if a kid says, I'm afraid there's a monster under the bed, I can't go to sleep. Why? Because I think there's a monster under the bed. We'll take a flashlight and look under there and see. And when we ask ourselves why we fear things, we often realize it's for ridiculous reasons. But if we don't ask ourselves why, we don't try to look for the evidence, and consequently, we just have this fearful image in our minds. Why are you afraid of spiders? 99.9% of all spiders are harmless. And the ones that are harmless aren't going to bother you unless you bother them. So why are you afraid? Because you've got this sort of phobia about it that creates a fear that's completely invalid. The same thing with snakes, and the same thing with a variety of other situations where people simply fear with no rational reason for fearing.
Well, that's true, because I can think of how I am with cockroaches. I see them and I go, oh my gosh, but I've learned that I've got to slam something down on them or I'm going to follow that cockroach somewhere along the way and they're going to fly away. So I agree with you. And snakes, I guess, are the same thing. But, you talk about management gurus claiming that if you can't measure it, it's not worth pursuing. And of course, some of our great management gurus from the years back used to say, what gets measured gets done. So what's an example of something that's measurable and something that is not measurable?
Well, look, I feel that you have to apply your own. The key thing is to apply your own metrics, not someone else's. So let's take something like happiness. You could make a point that, well, I don't know how you'd measure happiness, but I know when I'm happy, and I know what constitutes happiness for me. I know when I'm comfortable. I know when I'm safe, and most people do. But the key is you have to use your own metrics and not somebody else who tells you, well, you're really not safe. You're really not happy. That's the issue. So the issue is who's doing the measuring, not so much the measuring device. Who's doing the measuring? And you have to establish your own metrics. Otherwise, someone says, well, you did a really good job in school, but not as good as your sister. And now, instead of being, a star, you're in second place again.
Well, that's true, because I remember when I was in the seventh grade, my sister was a math whiz, and that was not one of my strong suits. And so when I got to algebra class, the teacher said to me, guys might like to have you in the living room, Gail, but you certainly don't know what you're doing in class like your sister did. And I thought, oh my gosh. And that really put me down. And to this day, I do not do well in anything like algebra, geometry, trig, anything like that. But I can add, subtract, multiply, and divide in my head, So I guess it's what's necessary and how you look at things. But you also talk about in this book tips that people can use to become more fearless. So can you give us some of those?
Well, I think you have to ask yourself, what is the actual issue that might arise that will cause me to be fearful, and deal with it. So if you're walking into a buyer's office and you say the buyer might reject me or feel I'm not right, well, then what do? You prepare better, you do some homework on the company, you come in with some original thoughts and some innovative ideas so that the likelihood of your being accepted will be great. If you're going to appear before an audience, you have to use rationality, and you say, look, no audience wants to go home and say, wow, we just saw a speaker go down in flames for an hour. That was great. What they want to say is we had a great time. So the audience is with you from the beginning. So you have to understand there's nothing to fear there. These people are on your side. You have to look at the rationality of this. And most people don't look at fear rationally. And that's the whole point of the book.
I was just going to say, but there's a lot of situations in which people just aren't rational, period. And they create all these scenarios in their mind, many of which never happen. but they can also make them happen just by thinking about them and getting into those kinds of situations. So when you started writing all these books, I mean, gosh, Alan, I don't think I have 64 of your books, but I know I have at least 10 of your books. Um, what what made you decide? Um, well, you've told us why you wrote this book, but what's the main point that you want the readers to take away from it?
Well, I'd like readers of Fearless Leadership to understand that there's really nothing to fear outside of the legitimate threats to bodily harm and illness and things like that. But nobody's shooting at you when you walk into an office in a company. I'd like readers to understand that they have more control than they think, and that life is not a scary proposition each morning. You know, you can either wake up in the morning and say, another great day where I can provide opportunity for people and for myself, or another slow crawl through enemy territory. And that's completely up to you. And that's the kind of control that I think people can gain if they read the book.
Well, I know that you have a tip piece, The Fallacy of Control, 4 Ways to Let Go. Is that possible for our listeners to be able to get a copy of that?
Well, I don't know. You mean outside of the book?
Yeah, in other words, I'm just trying to think if there's something that people could go to your website and download that would be beneficial to them immediately, and then because they may not know you the way I know you, and there's so many valuable pieces of information that you have that people can put to work right away, that I'd like them to get a taste of Alan and get your book.
Well, listen, I mean, if you go to alanweiss.com, there are hundreds of free articles and audio and video and all kinds of things that don't cost a penny and you can download. And I would suggest that your listeners look through there and find out the things that are most relevant for them in terms of leadership or fear or self-esteem or anything else.
All right. So, folks, you know where you have to go. Alan, that's ALAN, Weiss, WEISS.com. And he does. He has so much information on his website. It's unbelievable. But now, where would they get a copy of your book?
Well, you can go to my site and order it. I have a bookstore on my site, or you can go to Amazon or Barnes & Noble, all the usual suspects. Everybody's carrying it, and they're welcome to do it.
And so when we talk about some of the things that are in the book and some of the things that you talk about, I know one of the things that you mention is the threshold effect, where fear, temporary fear, outweighs, long-term pain. So what is that all about, the threshold effect?
Well, it's the refusal to take short-term pain to overcome long-term pain. So here are two examples. If you have a toothache and you have the prospect of long-term pain, you want to go to the dentist to alleviate it. Now, that means you're going to have to take probably a needle or two in your gum, which is short-term pain. But if you accept that, they will fix your teeth and the toothache will go away. Another much more dramatic example is that some people really would like it to divorce their spouse. Because they're in an unhappy relationship, and that unhappy relationship can go on for another 10 or 20 years. But they don't want the pain that comes with divorce in the short term. Some other people, however, will undergo the pain for a few months of a divorce to eliminate the long-term pain of a horrible relationship.
Well, yeah, those are great examples, and they're very different examples, and they're very, in your face, real-time things that people go through all of the time. Well, it's really interesting to me that, because I've seen you go from the consulting aspect to the esteem aspect to now the fear aspect. We've got about 2 or 3 minutes left, Alan. What is it that you would like to tell our audience that we have not talked about?
Well, I think that there's an issue here of control that is very important for people. And that is that there's some external control in your life, that the IRS or the weather, but there's a lot of internal control. You can get a good accountant to take care of the IRS demands. You can move something that's outside, inside if the weather turns bad. And life's really reciprocal that way. So we don't have total control of our lives, but nor are we expected to be, sort of a Calvinistic fatalism where we have no control whatsoever. Everything's predestined. And so I'd like people to know they have more control than they think. And therefore, they need to exert that control, because if they don't exert it, it's going to be taken away from them.
Well, that's very true. And, you are so fortunate, and I'm fortunate too, in that we associate with people who really believe they do have control and they will do what needs to be done to get where they need to go. But there are so many people out there, Alan, who are living lives of quiet desperation. And and that's something that perpetuates itself over and over and over. And they just don't ever seem to be able to get out of it. So, that's something that you really need to get a hold of Alan's books. He's got so many of them. Go to his website, alanweiss.com. See what he has to offer. Download his articles, watch his videos, get some of that, charge behind you, and go get his latest book, which, is Fearless Leadership. You can get it on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, on his website, wherever you'd like to go to get it. I tell you, it's well worth it. Alan, it has been an absolute delight to have you with us today. I want to thank you so much for this. And I know that I'll be seeing you very soon. As a matter of fact, I'm going to see you next month when you get down to Miami, and I'll be in your audience.
Well, it's always nice to be with you, Gail. Thank you for the invitation.
You're welcome.
Hi, this is Dr. Gail, and I wanted you to know I have a whole bunch of other things to offer you. If you go to spunkyoldbroad.com, you will see an array of SOB stuff for sale and all our latest products and additions. If you're interested in getting on TV, I have a brand new course, Get on TV. And if you want to start your own business, you'll want my SOB Guide to Business Success. I know you'll love them all. I guarantee it.
This is Dr. Gail Carson, thanking you for listening to Living Regret Free, the show that gives you skills and techniques to achieve a regret-free life. Don't live a life of stress and negativity when you could be experiencing a life of joy, happiness, and reward. Our guests all have valuable tips to make your life a better one. If you enjoyed today's show, then join us next week for more exciting and informative guests on Living Regret-Free. And I would love to hear from you as to people you'd like on the show, questions you have for me, and you can also email me at Gayle, that's Gayle Carson 13 @gmail.com, or go to my website, spunkyoldbroad.com.